Mr. Speaker, we have learned of the activities of today's NDP government with respect to the purchase of tiger dams for First Nations communities. Today's NDP government issued a press release last year on July 25th that highlighted the creation of, and I quote, the first emergency operations centre for First Nations in Canada. It said initial plans for the centre include, again I quote, rapid response flood equipment stationed centrally in the Lake St. Martin area. Will the Premier today tell us exactly where the centre is located and if the tiger dams purchased for flood protection were intended for flood fighting around Lake St. Martin?
Mr. Speaker, I thank the member for the question. We did more than that in that July 25th announcement. We talked about the need to provide a compensation program for fishers who had lost their livelihood because of the flooding that occurred in the Lake St. Martin area, Mr. Speaker, and we provided that to them and have followed through on that program. We also were working with the First Nations at that time to make sure that the emergency channel was open to allow the water to flow, Mr. Speaker. My understanding is that the Interlake Regional Tribal Council is part of a solution where they work with Peguis, who has equipment, extra equipment and special equipment to fight flood protection, Mr. Speaker, and as it turns out, they have even more equipment now that they've received federal money to purchase additional equipment, Mr. Speaker.
Mr. Speaker, in July 2014, water flowing into Lake Manitoba through the Portage Diversion caused concern about the rising water level of Lake St. Martin. The Minister of Infrastructure was apparently involved in an attempt to purchase $5 million of tiger dams, and he is alleged to have resorted to, and I quote, trying to bully his cabinet colleagues into doing something they knew was wrong. Mr. Speaker, this question is not a difficult level of transparency to achieve. Quite simply again, precisely where is the flood centre and were any of the water-filled tiger dams to be used to protect people around Lake St. Martin?
Mr. Speaker, the most important thing to protect the people around Lake St. Martin was to get the emergency channel flowing, because that lowered the level of the lake by a very significant amount of water, Mr. Speaker, which is why we built it in the first place, and we did it after consulting the First Nations in the area, Mr. Speaker. So that was the most important thing to do, was to get the channel open and to have the water flowing through that channel on a renewed emergency basis because of the high waters. The second thing to do was to give some comfort to the fishers who had lost their livelihood because of all the flooding disruption in their traditional territory where they were making a living. That program rolled forward. We also committed to working with First Nations on providing them with extra equipment. Peguis had additional equipment. It has additional equipment right now. It got additional equipment from the federal government. I understand the federal government is reviewing the acquisition process that we followed. We followed a tendering process in Manitoba, a tendering process under the management of the Department of Infrastructure, who looks after those matters, and to date, no tender has been awarded, Mr. Speaker. But we always were able to make available additional equipment and support to First Nations in the Interlake on a timely basis. We have a large stockpile of existing equipment, and we've always said if an emergency comes up, our existing equipment can be made available to you on an emergency basis as we build long-term capacity.
Order, please. The Honourable First Minister's time on this question has elapsed.
Mr. Speaker, the Free Press reported that the Minister's actions were so abundantly, obviously offside of standard tendering rules, and that today's NDP government operates in a way that ministers are personally making deals with third parties to buy goods. Yep. On January 19, 2011, Barry Prentice wrote in the Free Press that tiger dams are the least reliable system and that a product testing report supplied by the minister would not qualify for an elementary school science project. A finding confirmed in the 2011 Flood Review Task Force report, which I tabled. Did the Premier have good scientific evidence that the tiger dams would be effective in the terrain around Lake St. Martin, and if so, will he table that evidence today?
The member raises an important question. In my view, and this was the process that we followed in the tendering process, our officials consulted with the people that were looking after the flood protection measures for the Interlake Regional Tribal Council. We always said we want to get the right mix of equipment. Nobody should be able to dictate one specific product. We have to get the right mix of equipment. That includes aquadams, that includes HESCO barriers. There are uses for tiger dams as well, but you need the appropriate equipment in the appropriate place at the appropriate time. And we have all of those types of equipment in our arsenal right now, including traditional sandbags, including super sandbags. All of those tools were available to us, and we deploy those tools as necessary in appropriate and specific circumstances, and we can make those available on an emergency basis. The tendering process went through a proper procedure. No award has been made at this point, Mr. Speaker. The member knows full well that. His question is completely specious because he knows we haven't awarded the contract, Mr. Speaker.